What if a state could betray itself? What if a land that once stood united under one flag, one name, and one identity found itself so torn, so divided, that it could no longer remain whole? Imagine a place where neighbors turned into enemies, where geography became ideology, and where loyalty to country came at the cost of family. That place was Virginia. And in the blood-soaked years of America's Civil War, Virginia did something few could have imagined. It tore itself in half. From the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains came a defiant voice, one that refused to go along with secession, refused to fight for slavery, and refused to bow to Richmond's power. That voice became West Virginia. And its story isn't just about politics or war, it's about identity, survival, and the courage to stand alone. Long before bullets tore through American soil, the state of Virginia was already cracked beneath its surface. It was one of the original 13 colonies, the home of presidents, revolutionaries, and aristocrats. From George Washington to Thomas Jefferson, Virginia helped birth the United States. But within that proud history, a silent struggle had been growing. A struggle not of muskets or maps, but of class, culture, and control. To the east lay Virginia's power-fertile plantations, rolling fields of tobacco, and a wealthy elite who built their fortunes on the backs of enslaved people. This was the Virginia of Monticello and Mount Vernon, of mansions, old money, and a deeply embedded belief in the Southern way of life. These were the men who shaped laws, ran courts, and controlled the state's destiny. To the west, however, the land looked very different. Mountains rose where fields ended. Rivers carved through steep valleys, and small farms dotted the hillsides. The people here were mostly poor. They worked their own land, lived in log cabins, and fought hard winters with grit, not wealth. They didn't own slaves not because they were radicals, but because they couldn't afford to. Their economy didn't run on human bondage. It ran on sweat, coal, salt, and iron. And with every law passed in Richmond that favored the East, the divide grew deeper. Representation in the state legislature was skewed toward the East. Taxes funded projects that served Eastern trade routes and plantation interests. Roads, railways, and investments skipped the mountains entirely. Western Virginians felt like second-class citizens in their own state. They cried out for equality, for fairness, for basic recognition. But their voices were drowned out by aristocrats in powdered wigs and polished boots. By the 1850s, this wasn't just a rift, it was a chasm. And then came Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln was elected in 1860, the country's fragile balance shattered. Southern states saw his rise as a death knell for slavery. Though Lincoln promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, he refused to allow it to expand. That was enough for the Deep South. One by one, the southern states began to secede. South Carolina went first, then Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. The Union was falling apart. But Virginia hesitated. Virginia was torn. It shared the South's values, but not all its urgency. The decision to leave the Union wasn't made lightly. In Richmond, the state's leaders debated for months. Would they join the Confederacy or stay loyal to the Union they helped create? Western Virginians watched with anxiety. They didn't want secession. They didn't want war. And they certainly didn't want to fight for slavery. Then came the spark that lit the flame. On the 12th of April, 1,861 Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. War had begun. In response, President Lincoln called on the states to supply troops to put down the rebellion. When he asked Virginia to send soldiers to fight against the South, it was too much. On the 17th of April, 1,861, Virginia voted to secede. But not everyone agreed. In the West, outrage erupted. County after county denounced the decision, They hadn't voted for this. They hadn't asked for war. And they certainly didn't want to fight against the very Union they believed in. So they gathered. In Wheeling, a small but determined group of delegates from the northwestern counties met in secret and then in public. Their mission was simple: resist. They called themselves Unionists. They believed Virginia's secession was illegal, and they refused to be dragged down with it. On May 13, 1861, the first Wheeling Convention was held. Here, leaders declared their loyalty to the Union and began planning what would become one of the boldest moves in American history. They organized a second Wheeling Convention just a month later. There, they declared the government in Richmond invalid and formed the Restored Government of Virginia. This government, loyal to the United States, would act as the legitimate authority of the entire state, even though Richmond still claimed that title for itself. But behind the scenes, something even more radical was underway. These western counties weren't just resisting secession, they were preparing to break away entirely, to become their own state, a new state, one that would stand with the Union, not against it. They faced enormous obstacles. The U.S. Constitution states that no new state can be formed from an existing one without that state's consent. Normally, that would have stopped them in their tracks. But these were not normal times. The restored government of Virginia, though, made up of only Western representatives, was considered by the Union to be the legal government of Virginia. And that government gave consent for the creation of a new state. In late 1861, a referendum was held across the western counties. Despite the chaos of war, the majority voted in favor of forming a new state, but the process was far from over. A new constitution had to be written, borders had to be drawn, and Congress had to approve. President Lincoln was cautious. He knew the legal arguments were shaky, and he worried that supporting the split might alienate loyalists in other border states. But he also saw the strategic importance. West Virginia was rich in coal and minerals resources the Union desperately needed. It bordered Ohio and Pennsylvania Union strongholds, and its people were already fighting Confederate raiders. In the end, Lincoln chose practicality over perfection. On the 31st of December, 1862, he signed the bill that would allow West Virginia to enter the Union. And on the 20th of June, 1863, West Virginia officially became the 35th state. It was the only state to be born directly from the Civil War. But the birth wasn't clean. Several counties in the new state had Confederate sympathies. Some had even voted against statehood. In the southern parts of what is now West Virginia, violence broke out. Families were split, towns turned on one another. Confederate and Union forces clashed repeatedly along the mountains. The war that tore the nation apart now tore through communities that had once lived in uneasy peace. After the war ended in 1865, Virginia was devastated. Its cities burned, its economy shattered, its people exhausted. Richmond, once the capital of the Confederacy, lay in ruins. But West Virginia, though battered, stood tall. It had survived not just a war but the impossible challenge of being born in the middle of one. For years, Virginia refused to accept the split. Lawsuits were filed. Boundaries were challenged. At one point, the state sued West Virginia over the control of Berkeley and Jefferson counties. The matter reached the U.S. Supreme Court, and in 1871, the court ruled in favor of West Virginia. The split was final, legal, permanent. The two Virginias moved forward separately. Virginia eventually rebuilt. It remained proud, deeply Southern, and rooted in its traditions. It struggled with Reconstruction, grappled with civil rights, and slowly transformed into the diverse state it is today. West Virginia, meanwhile, leaned into its ruggedness. It became a land of miners, mountaineers, and labor battles. The coal it produced, powered America's factories, fueled its railroads, and lit up its cities. But that power came at a price: dangerous work, environmental destruction, and generations of poverty. Still, West Virginians remained proud of what they had done. In breaking away, they had taken a stand against slavery, against secession, against silence. They had carved their place in the Union not through privilege, but through persistence. And maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. This wasn't just a split on a map, it was a rupture of identity, a breaking point born not from hate but from principle. West Virginia was formed by people who believed so deeply in the Union that they were willing to leave everything behind to stay with it. Today, when you drive through the valleys of West Virginia or visit the historical towns along the Shenandoah River, you can still feel the tension, the pride, the stubborn independence that gave birth to a state. And when you look at a map and see the line between Virginia and West Virginia, remember, that line isn't just geography, it's history carved into the land. So if this story taught you something new, stirred your curiosity, or helped you understand the past in a different way, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more powerful untold stories from America's hidden history. Because sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones fought with guns, but the ones fought with conviction. And sometimes the deepest divisions give rise to the strongest identities. That's the story of Virginia and the birth of West Virginia.